I'm going to help introduce this highly anticipated speaker. My name is
Megan.
I'm glad to be here at
Affiliate Summit.
I can't begin to tell you what an honor it is to introduce our next guest, whom we all know as
Tracy Ela. I mean Major Cory Booker. Mayor. Cory.
Rarely does one have the opportunity to be on the same stage with someone as intelligent and experienced as
Mayor Cory Booker.
On a personal note, I've had a long friendship with
Mayor Cory Booker.
Since we first discovered our mutual interest in
Horseback riding.
And
Mad Gabs.
I'll never forget when we discovered
YouTube.
In
College.
That was the best hunting trip ever. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to
Elvis. Mayor Cory Booker.
It's time to get away. It's time to get away from you. It's time to get away. It's time to get away from you. You brought a lot of money, but me, I'm catching tidy tummy.
Good morning, everybody. I am so proud of America, no matter what your race, creed, or color is. You can do something and engage in yourself and make a difference in the world. Now, I know it's early. I know this is the first session of the day. I know some of you are thinking, why is the mayor of Newark, New Jersey here at an affiliate summit marketing convention? Is anybody asking that question at all? Yeah, gosh. Well, good. Hopefully some point over the next 20 or 30 minutes, we can all figure this out together. But the reality is, I'm honored to be here. I'm really proud that I was asked. And I'd like to, if I can, just share a few moments about my life that hopefully will affect some of the things that you all are doing. And actually, not simply about my life or who I am, but I actually grew up with a father who spent his entire life with one sort of overriding dream. When he was a kid growing up in North Carolina, and I have to tell you, my father's stories get more and more incredible the longer I hear the same stories over and over again. So at first, you know, he would go to school in North Carolina in the mountains, and the air was thin, it was difficult to climb it. By the end of his stories, now that he's in the 60s, the stories are usually, it was a snowstorm every day, Cory, and the school was a one-room schoolhouse that actually didn't have walls. We just sat outside in the snow and learned. But my father, since he was a little kid growing up in this segregated town in the South, he was a dreamer about being a marketer, being a salesman. And he pursued his dream his entire life. And by the time I was born, I grew up in a table full of the most colorful stories that in many ways, my life and my work that's taken me from my academic world at Stanford University and going overseas to study on a Rhodes Scholar and back to law school at Yale to my professional work in inner city Newark, New Jersey. So many of the life lessons that I've learned have come from a salesman, from somebody who was trying to, in many ways, as he saw it, trying to improve the world, trying to empower people with his products, with his ideas, with what he was doing. One of my father's earliest stories I remember about this one-room schoolhouse was he was sitting down in the back of the class. My father said he was a hard-headed kid, was a cut-up, and this teacher walked in and looked at the class, and she didn't last that long. And she said, "Class, I'm here to talk to you all today about self-esteem. Anybody here in this classroom thinks you're stupid, I want you to stand up right now." And my father said he just sat in the back of the classroom and didn't move. And everybody looked at him, and my father sort of was the king of the class, and just everybody stayed still, looking at the teacher, back at the teacher, just standing there waiting for folks. And she said, come on now, class, I want to teach you all about self-esteem, about loving yourself. If you think you're dumb, if you think you're stupid, I want you to stand up right now. And my father said nobody moved, but finally he pushed his chair back and stood up. And the teacher looks at him and says, Mr. Booker Boy, what's wrong with you? You think you're dumb? You think you're stupid? And my father said, well, shucks, ma'am, I don't think I'm stupid, but I didn't want you to be the only one standing. So the earliest lessons I got from my dad about success, about making sure that you make your impact on the world, was first and foremost knowing who you are and knowing that this world sends you constantly lots of different messages. And too many times, my father said, we're going to make sure our lives are only attuned to the negativity, to the doubts, to the cynicism, to people telling you you're not good enough for whatever reason. You're too large, you're too short, you're too small, you're too black, you're too white. You name it, they're going to send you those negative messages. But what my father said is you have to understand your internal barometer. You have to know who you are. You can't go about doing anything unless you're firmly situated in the profound understanding that you are a divine creation. You are somebody that the conspiracy of the universe created. You're someone with infinite potential. Now, to me, this is a lesson I've gotten over and over and over again. That, in fact, I changed it as I got older and as my dad's stories got more interesting to talk more about this knowledge of self than just simply having a great vision. Not a vision of the world around you, first and foremost, a vision of yourself. My father once and rightfully said that the most important conversations you have in your life are the conversations you don't have with other people or folks that might have titles like major or mayor or whatever. But they're actually the ones that you have internally, the voice in your head and what does it say. Look, I've spent my entire professional career working in inner city communities. And it's in these places that I've probably seen some of the greatest American heroes I've ever met. I've seen people who have such profound wisdom and have reinforced my father's messages over and over and over again. When I was a teenager, 18 years old, I was working in an inner city area called East Palo Alto, California. I was going to Stanford University. I went out there on a football scholarship. I always tell people I got to Stanford because of my 4.0 and my 1,600. 4.0 yards per carry and 1,600 receiving yards as a high school student. And I decided that my life and so much of what my parents said had to be about service and had to be about giving back. And my father used to always say the universe is a balanced place. The more you give into the universe, the more you're going to receive. So I started working in East Palo Alto and found just a rich community of great people and kids that I could really connect with. And I remember at the end of the summer, I was asked by some of the other counselors to give a nice message to some of the young boys that we were working with. And I had heard this speaker once at a program sort of like this that gave this speech about that you can always do more. Don't limit yourself. And he had everybody stand up in the room, which I will not do to you all. I know you're tired. Everybody stood up. And he said, now raise your hand as high as you could. And I remember raising my hand as high as I could, stretching it up. And now the speaker said, okay, now raise it 3 inches higher. And then I just stood on my tiptoes, and a lot of other people did that. And then he gave this powerful message about you can always do a little bit more. You can always go a little bit further. And so I decided to do this with the kids. So I said, fellas, gather around, gather around. We're going to do a little experiment here on the last day, and I want you all to raise your hands as high as you can. Now, these kids were kind of tough, and they were tired at the end of the day, and they looked at me and said, no, man, I don't want to do that. Oh, this is stupid. Where's the food? Oh, don't raise your hand, man. You got BO. Stop that. And so I decided, not being the best psychologist when it comes to children that there are, I resorted to a very base level of persuasion that some of you might know about. I reached into my pocket and I pulled out a $5 bill and I decided to bribe the kids. And please, I am a public official. Don't use that word too often around me. And I offered the kid $5 to raise your hand the highest. And immediately, these young men, being the great American capitalists that they were, shot their hands in the air. Now they're all comparing themselves to each other, squeezing next to each other to see who's got the biggest arm reach, standing on their tiptoes. And then all of a sudden, as I sat there in smug satisfaction, looking at these young people, I looked over to my left and I saw Robert. Now, Robert was the shortest and youngest of the whole group. And I'm telling you, this kid was one of the cutest kids you'll ever see. He looked like a young Emmanuel Lewis and a young Gary Coleman mixed together. And his face was sort of all in a pout. Looks like he had just said, "What you talking about, Willis?" And his arms were crossed, and he looked down on the ground. And I thought this was the last one of the whole group who I wanted to squelch his vision of who he was. I didn't want to. This is the last kid because he had a difficult home life. The last child that I wanted to make him not believe in himself, that he can compete with other people. So I'm about to walk over to him and put my arm on his shoulder and say to him, "Look, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about this exercise. Don't worry about it. You and I can talk." And while they're doing this, but suddenly he turns around and sprints through the door. And I run after this kid, sprint after him, and grab him from behind and pick him up. And his legs are still wiggling around as he's trying to run away from me. And I turn him around and I say, "Robert," I said, what's wrong with you, man? Where are you going?" And he looked at me hard as if I was crazy, then looked over with the other kids and looked back at me with the wisdom that betrayed his age. He said to me, "You said you'd give $5 to the kid who can raise his hand the highest, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, I know a way to get to the roof." I gave him the $5. This to me is a message from out of the mouth of a babe, out of a kid, who basically said to me, "Shake your self-image, Cory. You think in terms of doing just 3 inches higher. I think in terms of getting to the roof. You think in terms of walking or running faster. I think in terms of flying." Now, we are here as a people because individuals in every sector of American society saw themselves as not someone that was going to be good, not someone that was going to just beat somebody else, but they had a transformative vision of themselves, of their families, of their lives, had a transformative vision of their country, had a transformative vision of life. This is what greatness is. I sat around a table, dinner after dinner after dinner, listening to one of the greatest dreamers God had ever created, my father. And some of his greatest dreams involved his kids and what they would achieve, and he would never, ever accept anything less than our boldest visions of ourselves and who we can be. But why have we gotten to a point where we so often, every single day, because of limited vision, lack of understanding, a boldness, a lack of boldness, as I often say, a poverty of imagination, why do we so often sell ourselves short? Look, I work in Newark, New Jersey, and it's the city that I love the most in America. It has a reputation issue that many people tell me because the vision people have of it is stuck in a time that doesn't exist. And as I joined the world of Newark, New Jersey, this incredible place, it was people within this city that kept giving me this lesson over and over and over again, challenging me as a young activist coming out of law school, challenging me as someone who said they wanted to make a difference, challenging me as someone who said, as many of us might have said in our lives, that I want to change the world. I remember my first time in the early mid-90s coming to Newark, New Jersey, I thought to myself, I'm going to live my craziest vision of myself. I was fueled by my father a bit. And I moved onto a challenging street in the city with a lot of problems, with drug dealing and violence and crime and high-rise projects that were in difficult shape. And I remember just being, frankly, overwhelmed by what I was seeing and what I was watching. I used to joke with a friend of mine, they had a pharmaceutical trade on that street that could put Johnson and Merck and Johnson & Johnson to shame. Rite Aid could have learned a couple lessons, and I would see lines of people from the suburbs coming in to buy their pharmaceutical products. And I remember at this point, a friend of mine told me, "Cory, if you really want to make a difference in that neighborhood, you've got to meet the leader of that neighborhood, the Queen Mother." And she happened to live in these public housing projects. And I love the universe because it sends you these messages sometimes. Because I was growing up as a kid, my parents and even my grandparents used to always tell me when I was to graduate from these Ivy League schools, they said, "Boy, never forget that you can learn more from a woman on the 5th floor of the project than you can from one of these fancy professors." And lo and behold, I found out the address of this woman, and she lived on the 5th floor of the projects. And I went up to knock on her door. And I'll never forget, I knocked on her door in my youthful arrogance. And it's like this UCLA linebacker voice came from the other side. "Who is it?" And I said, "It's Cory Booker." And she opens the door and she goes, "Who are you?" And again, I'm an arrogant young man. I pull up my pants and say, "Ma'am, I'm Cory Booker. I'm from Yale Law School, ma'am. I'm here to help you out." I almost felt like that Western theme should have gone off. Doo-doo-doo. And she looks me up and down and she goes, "You want to help me?" And I go, yeah. And she looks me up and down and says, we exchange some more words, and she goes, well, if you really want to help me, you got to follow me first. And I say, okay. This woman pushes past me, closes her door, walks down 5 flights of stairs, walks through the lobby of the building, walks through the courtyard, walks onto the side of the street, walks through some pharmaceutical salesman, at which point I'm standing close to her, and she walks into the middle of the street. Now I'm in the middle of one of the largest boulevards in the neighborhoods in Newark, and she swings around, and she goes, boy, tell me what you see around you. And I said, what? She goes, tell me what you see around you. And I said, okay, well, I see some high-rise public housing. I see there was an abandoned building that people used for nefarious things, and I said, I see that, and I talked about the graffiti, and I just described what I saw around me. And she looks at me, and she shakes her head, and she goes, boy, you can never, ever help me. And she turns around and storms off. And I'm standing there in the middle of the street thinking to myself, what the heck just happened? And so I run after her, and I put my hand on the back of this elderly woman, and I say, ma'am, what are you talking about? And she whirls around, and she says to me, you need to understand something, boy. And I go, what? She goes, the world you see outside of you is a reflection of what you have inside of you. If you're one of these people who only sees problems or darkness and despair, that's all there's ever going to be. But if you're one of those people who sees hope, opportunity, and love, then you can make a change and help me. She walks off, leaving me there in the middle of the street. And I tell you, the uncomfortableness of standing there made me go back to my apartment that I had rented across the street from where she lived, but the storm of these messages that my dad had sent me as a growing up, and quotes I had read from learned scholars from humanity. I remember Emerson said something powerful. He said, that only which we have within can we see without. And I love this, to paraphrase the end of this quote. He says, that only which we have within can we see without. If we see no angels, it's because we harbor none. And so here I was, being one of those people, those limited imagination Americans, who just does such a good job sitting back and doing color commentary on the world around us, describing things as they are, never changing their sight about what can be. And this took me back to my kitchen table with my dad. My dad loves stories about salesmen, always talking about stories about salesmen. And I remember he tells me this one story where 2 men are dropped off on an island to sell shoes. And both men, within 10 minutes on the island, are screaming for the boat to come back. One guy calls back and says, get me the heck off this island. These are natives here. None of them wear shoes. The other man calls back and says, come back to the island and bring me 6 crates of shoes. There's only natives on the island. None of these people wear shoes. I can make 1,000 sales. It's all about how you see the world. Vision controls reality. I react against this every single day in my community as I look at my state of New Jersey, as I look at our nation. You can't tell me that we should be satisfied with the way things are. You can't tell me that we can't do better as a people. You can't tell me that we can't create miracles all around us by first and foremost changing our vision, changing our attitude. I remember once when we had finally started working together, me and Miss Virginia Jones is a woman's name, profound, powerful woman. And first I started by coming correct. I just sat at her table and listened time and time and time again to her stories. I learned. I always say I got my BA from Stanford, but my PhD from the streets of Newark. And eventually we started organizing, and as a young lawyer, I started representing the residents against the horrible slumlord, in my opinion, that ran the buildings. The slumlord was convicted in federal court for a lot of crimes, and we were able to clean up a lot of the neighborhood, help some of the guys that were dealing drugs get into other things, and clear many of the other ones off. We got the abandoned building across the street torn down, and we were able to make a lot of these improvements in this area. And I'll never forget, we had this huge festival, this huge block party, you can call it. And we had dunk tank, and Miss Jones made me be the first person that sits in the dunk tank. And we had just a phenomenal street party. And I remember talking to the daughter of somebody who had passed away during this time that we were making a lot of these improvements. And I remember saying to her, I go, it's such a shame that your mother couldn't live to see this. Now, her mother was one of these people who was a major part of this tenant coalition that mostly, especially in the beginning, most of the activists working with Ms. Jones were other elderly African-American women who had this profound vision. And I remember saying to her, it's a shame your mother couldn't be here to see this. And she sort of laughed. She goes, Cory, are you kidding me? My mother always saw this. This power to see the world as it truly is, not as how it masquerades. The power to see yourself as you truly are. This is one of the biggest challenges. People ask me all the time, you're a new mayor in the city of Newark, Cory. You had this big election that upset the machine that was there. I'm the first mayor since 1970. I'm sorry, the second mayor since 1970. And what's the biggest challenge you're facing? And I love talking about the challenges we have because to me a challenge is just brilliantly disguised as an opportunity. And I'll tell you about one of them in a moment, but the first thing I always say is the biggest challenge we have in Newark, the biggest challenge we have in my state, the biggest challenge we have in America, in fact, the biggest global challenge that there is a challenge of the spirit, is a challenge of vision, is a challenge and a test of our ideals, of who we say that we are going to be. And this is the problem. I'm a student of history. If you look at every major civilization that has fallen, you look at, we're celebrating, if there's anybody who's Jewish in the audience, we just finished celebrating, marking a day of fasting in the Jewish faith, and it was marking the fall of the Second Temple in the year 70, excuse me, not 1970, no temples fell in 1970, but in the year 70. If you look at the reason that fell, if you look at the Roman Empire, and why did the Roman Empire fall? If you look at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union falling in our lifetime, and you realize that most great civilizations don't fall simply because of external threats. So many of them fall because of internal corruption, because of a failure to manifest their ideals, of a failure to be who they claim that they are, a failure to put their lives or their communities or their cities or their nations in balance. I challenge Americans about this all the time is, are we living up to our highest ideals of ourselves? And if we're not, what are you as an individual American doing to try to engage in that process of struggle to manifest your ideals? In Newark, we're the same thing. I remember, again, I get into office and just trying to get people to understand who we are as a people. We're Newarkers, the nation's third oldest city. Every century, Newark, New Jersey, was leading American cities. In the 1940s, on the front page of Harper's Magazine, it's the most livable city in America. Do you know who you are? Wake up. You're an American. You're a Newarker. You stand for something. I remember my father, when he was working for IBM, was the company he worked for. IBM had a disastrous time in the 1980s. It was a company that had been at the forefront, had been one of the best companies for the longest time, succeeding in a new industry, but they started to fail. They started to go down tragically and quickly. And I remember reading some great books, and one of my favorite authors is a guy named Thomas Friedman, who's a columnist for the New York Times, and he writes about the book called The World is Flat and talks about the challenges of businesses and companies and corporations keeping up with the rapidly changing time. And I'm so honored to be in front of a crowd like this because it seems in many ways you all understand how to use technology, new information, the new global economy to work for you. But here's my father, I witnessed this, that IBM had to change its entire way of thinking about itself, had to be willing to change its paradigm. IBM, for example, used to all be about, in fact, the whole world used to be about how big is your mainframe. IBM used to have these huge mainframes. How big is your company? IBM used to have these large companies, thousands and thousands of employees. And this was what it was about. It was size. Size wins. The bigger country, the bigger company, the bigger person. But the world changed radically in the 80s and 90s. It was no longer about the size of your mainframe. It was about the speed of your connections, how nimble you were. Suddenly companies were moving and coming up around IBM that were building smaller computers, laptops, small gadgets that can get the same jobs done. Suddenly it wasn't about the size of your company more, it was how small you were. People were rolling off divisions, creating a small, nimble entities that could react better. And so this is what I watched around my table with my father. And I remember when I got into government, I was so upset because I saw that we were still operating government in a pre-1980s reality when the rest of the world had moved on. Now, some of you who like revenue might think that some of the things we did were great revenue models. Like, for example, I couldn't understand in Newark why it took so long to pay a parking ticket. You could come to the city hall and wait on a line. You'd have to navigate a Byzantine labyrinth of back offices. And by the time you paid a parking ticket, if you had parked your car in front of City Hall, by the time you got back to your car an hour or two later, your meter had run out and you had another ticket. So to me, again, a great revenue model, but it wasn't the way government should move. We started seeing that we had to start to reinvent the way we as an institution thought about ourselves, our vision of who we were. And we had to get the world obviously thinking differently about Newark. And we started doing a lot of different things that were so good, so great, but at the end of the day, we had to shake people's ideas about themselves. Now, crime fighting, some of you might know this, but the #1 city in the United States of America into reducing violent crime, and it's not Chicago, it's not Philadelphia, it's not Boston, it's not New York, it's not LA, San Francisco. The #1 city in reducing violent crime in America after 2 years, and I've been a mayor for 2 years, is Newark, New Jersey. We're down well over 40% in murders, well over 40% in shootings. We're beginning to reclaim the sanctity and the peace of our community. But the reality is that it was a challenge definitely towards policing. And I can give you a PhD thesis on a lot of the things we did to change policing. But a lot of it was changing the spirit of our community and how we thought about ourselves. And I remember going out in 2007, working really hard to reduce crime. At the end of 2007, people were patting us on the back. There's a national police organization called the Police Executive Research Foundation that was like, good job, Mr. Mayor in Newark, New Jersey. You guys reduced murders 5%. That's incredible. And they started telling us how great we did. And after hearing all this feedback at the end of 2007, I turned to my staff and my team and I said, guys, I'm looking for radical change, not incremental change. What can we do as a team to shake the foundations of what people believe is possible? Because that's the only limitation we have. What can we do to prove to the world who we really are? What can we do to reveal our true selves? What can we do to create what other people are going to call a miracle and we simply believe is what was possible? So I began this year in the probably weirdest daily schedule of any mayor in America. I began doing my job as mayor, everything from I'm very good at cutting ribbons and breaking ground. Guys, I can do that really well with a flair, doing that groundbreaking stuff. You know, managing an entire day. But then at night, I would get into a police car and start driving around the city until about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, patrolling the city. First, I wanted to send the message to those officers that are out on the front lines in the most difficult times to let them know if the mayor himself said the #1 thing we're focused on is public safety. And people were sort of shocked. I had a lot of fun. If you're a young black guy in America, having been pulled over many times driving a car, now I got to pull over police cars. It was really fun. I'd turn my lights on, I'd see a police officer, I'd pull him over, I'd walk over to the car. Sir, let me see your identification. And I'd pull his log sheet and I would see the kind of things that he was doing and I would talk to him. I would reinforce to him our ideals, reinforce to him our vision, reinforce to him who he was. I recast his whole way of thinking. I said, you're on the front lines of the fight for America. Some people might think it's over in the Middle East. Some people might think it's on any kind of foreign front. But this is right here. It's unacceptable to me that 34 Americans die every single day at the hands of violence. It's unacceptable to me that there are thousands and thousands of families all across America who are mourning the deaths or the injuries of their families. And I said, we in Newark, New Jersey are put here for a reason, I said. We're put here for the greatest reason possible. God created this moment because we are going to prove to America that we can solve these problems. And I can't do it. I don't have a badge, I don't have a gun, I wish I had a cape, but I don't. Really, you are the person that's going to do this. You are the great soldier of America. You're the one fighting for the freedom of our minds first to believe something can be done. And I spent my first quarter of 2008 out there in the streets of the city of Newark. I got the stomach virus twice, but I still pushed myself with a great team of people, and by the end of our first quarter, we were down 75% in murders in the city of Newark, shocking people about what was possible. Because we tried to change folks' vision. Not just the police officers in our city, but also even the residents. Why do we tolerate so much? Why do we put up with so much as Americans? When we know who we are, we brag about it. There are children every single day that stand up and say the most aspirational things. They say that we're one nation. Why do we tolerate divisions? Under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That means something. So this has been the engagement that I've had for the last 2 years of my life, trying to take so many of the messages and the ideals and the visions of my father and to put them in place in the world of Newark, New Jersey. This incredible city with incredible people, with unbelievable, untapped, unlimited, infinite potential. But the idea alone is not about vision. It's not about knowing who you are. It's more than that. It's not about even recognizing the world around you. To me, it's more than that. There's something else that I have to say that's to me just as important. It's somehow finding the ability, not just with your eyes, not just with your heart, not just with your spirit, to recognize the world around you. There has to be another step. And this is a step I love because I do it with kids all over Newark all the time, and I love it because it's my favorite math problem. Now, my great introducer, Megan, how are you doing? Do you feel thoroughly embarrassed in front of your peers? You do. So you're used to it now. So I'm going to give Megan a math problem. How could I just give 20-minute exposition, so eloquently I must say, about vision, belief, understanding who you are? Come on. If you think you can't, you can't. If you think you can't, you are the math wizard. You're the math master. You are the diva of division. Right? All right, so this was a math problem. I loved it. Got it as a little kid. And it was the second part. First is just understanding who you are, remembering the greatness. There's a wonderful book called by Carter G. Woodson, who's a phenomenal great American who writes this book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And he writes in it this wonderful quote. He said, the primary cause of human suffering, that's a powerful thing. The primary cause of human suffering, he says, is forgetfulness. People who've forgotten who they are. And in that moment, you forgot who you were, sister. You are, pow, ba-boom. Don't you think so? Sometimes. Oh, okay, well, this is a math problem for my friend Megan, the math maven, the master of mathematics, the diva of division. Yes? The superstar of subtraction. I could go on all day with this. All right, so here I am, little kid, not as wise, not the sagacious soul that stands to my left, but here I was, this little kid, and my father and others told me this math problem. 3 frogs, Megan. That's all that's involved in this story. 3 frogs. 3 frogs, Megan, are sitting on a log. Just 3. Not a train moving with 20,000 frogs from the west San Francisco to, no, just 3 frogs sitting on a log. Can you see the frogs? Vision. I talked all about vision. Can you see them? What color are they?
Greenish.
You are so boring. This is your world. How could you just, Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. It's so true. Aquamarine frogs. We're getting a little better, but aquamarine frogs. So you've got these frogs visualized in your mind, right? And they're sitting on a log. Is a log a color? Purple log. Okay. Okay. I'd hate to see you where you live. Your fashion sense. Okay. A purple frog clashing horribly with these 3 aquamarine frogs. Okay, these frogs got to go. Okay, did you name your frogs, by the way? Because I like to, personalize my frogs. And if you say Kermit, I'm going to say no imagination that was taken. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You go, girl. All right. Now, Shadrach is sitting there on this log and decides to jump off. 4, usually I give cash to the kids in Newark for this, but 4, the honor and respect and reverence, approbation of your peers here before you. How many frogs? Now that Shadrach has decided to jump off, how many frogs are on that log?
2.
Oh, no. No. Does anybody know the answer to the question? What's that? None? What's your name? Rhea, you are brilliant, you are beautiful, you are phenomenal, but you're wrong, okay? I see you for who you truly are. You did not reveal yourself in that moment, though, but I see you for who you truly are. Anybody know the answer? Yes, sir. 3, yes. Why is there 3 frogs on the log?
He decided he did not jump.
Thank you very much. Did you hear that? He decided to jump. He did not actually jump. Deciding to do something is a cognitive process. It is not a physical act. He made a decision in his mind. And so this, to me, was the definition, my dad said, of greatness. Have the vision. Have the ideals. Have the boldest sense of who you are. But unless it converts in a powerful way to action, then you're going to be lost. Now, this, to me, is such a essence of greatness that I witnessed in all my readings of history. My favorite people embodied this very idea of integrity, making your thoughts, your words correspond to your actions. Who is, to me, the greatest historical figure of integrity there is? It's a guy that I read so much about in Oxford when I was studying there, was devouring his books, and I tell you, when I started wearing sandals because of this guy, because he wore sandals all over the place. You know who I'm talking about? Yeah, who? Was that you? I knew it. I saw it. Oh my gosh. Yes, it was Gandhi. I even shaved my head, but that was just a preventative strike on the real thing. So there's a story about Gandhi where he's sitting there weaving all of this cloth, and this woman comes in to see him with her child. She's taking her child with her, and she says, Mahatma, Gandhi, sir, you emphasize dietary discipline. But my son, he reveres you, but he does not follow all of your teaching. He eats way too much sugar. His teeth are rotting out. I ask you, Gandhi, would you please tell my son, he will listen to you, Mahatma, would you please tell my son to stop eating sugar? And Gandhi gets up from where he's standing. He stands there humbly and looks at her for a few moments and looks at the boy and looks back at her and says, no, I will not do that. And the woman begins to protest, and he says, no. Just come back in 2 months and ask me again. And she thinks that's a little strange, and she leaves disappointed. 2 months pass. She waits in this long line to have an odd audience with Gandhi, and she gets back in the tent, and she says, Mahatma, I have returned. My son, his health is deteriorating because of his dietary habits. Would you please tell my son, please tell him, to stop eating sugar? And Gandhi gets up again, looks at her humbly, and then walks over to her and then turns to the boy and puts his hand on the boy's shoulder. And the boy is incredibly moved. The Mahatma has touched him. And he says, my son, you must stop eating sugar. And the boy is obviously affected. The woman is incredibly happy. She turns to leave, thanking Gandhi as she goes. And she turns and suddenly she stops and she says, I mean you no disrespect, but Mahatma, why didn't you just tell my son to stop eating sugar 2 months ago? And Gandhi looked at her and said, almost with an obviousness, he says, because 2 months ago I was eating sugar. The most incredible thing I've learned is if you cannot just have that vision, but if you can find a way to make your life resonate with who you are, not just in your being, but in your doing, that's when things begin to happen. And for me, watching my dad, he worked every single day, and would even talk about his slips in integrity, but worked every single day to live his life to the most wildest extremes. My father was this guy who believed in kindness and just believed in niceness. And it used to just be so torturous to a young boy who did not want to be embarrassed by his parents. And I know there are many parents in here who torture your kids, so you will get this. Now I realize, it's my favorite quote by James Baldwin, who says, children are never good at listening to their elders, but they never fail to imitate them. And yes, I am now torturing other young people around me by embarrassing them. But my father just used to talk to me all the time about the power of kindness. But he would take it to extremes. He would get into 25-minute conversations with a checkout girl at the supermarket. He'd be on the phone asking for information on the operator. Next thing you know, he'd be counseling them about their problems. This is my father who gave me example after example, day after day, about living your highest ideals, living them to the most logical extreme. And to me, this is ultimately the challenge. I believe sincerely that this is another way of saying that if you can live in a way consistent with your being, your highest being, then you can live in a way that is consistent with the largest love there is. Now, it may sound corny, but if I can give you one example of this, that was another gift to me of someone who I just revere. Now, even in the most difficult circumstances, and I believe, by the way, when everything's going well, it's easy to do the right thing. When everything's going great, it's easy to be magnanimous. When the chips are down, when you're struggling, when you're suffering, that's when it's hard. When you've had a bad day and you come home at the end of the day and somebody does one little small thing that in and of itself wouldn't annoy you, but you explode on them. If you can turn a moment like that into something that's more consistent with yourself and with your being, that to me is a great example of love. But the example I give always about living your values to their extreme is probably the person who has the ignominious distinction of being the first person I ever represented as a lawyer. And I was assigned to this woman, and I remember going to meet my client where she lived. And it was at some of the most challenging public housing in this particular city. And I remember knocking on her door, and she opened the door, and I saw a face there that had seen the years, worn with lines, and she was hunched over, and she had a swollen tongue, and spoke with a little bit with difficulty. And she brought me into a space, and I looked at this space, and I thought to myself, I'm going to fight to keep her in this apartment. And I sat down, and I started talking with her, and I found out that she was being evicted from her apartment because of a very draconian law that public housing authorities have in America. And that law basically is if one person in a family is caught dealing drugs or in drug possession, they move to evict the entire family. Now, this woman had a very difficult circumstances. She had a disability. That's why she had some scars on her face, and she would fall into seizures, and she really needed somebody to be around all the time. And the only person she could find to be around was her 19-year-old nephew. And her 19-year-old nephew was caught with 38 vials of crack cocaine. So after listening to this story, I thought it was outrageous to take this poor woman and evict her for this problem. So I went back to my supervising attorney, all full of righteous indignation. And I told my supervising attorney, I said to her, I told her the facts of the case, and I said, we're going to fight this case. I'll take it to the Supreme Court if I have to. And she looked at me, she started shaking her head. She says, Cory, look, I've seen hundreds and dozens of these cases. Look, you don't have that much of a chance of winning. In fact, I'd say you have a 5 or 10% chance at best. I don't care if you call Johnny Cochran and the Dream Team, Cory. This is a sort of ironclad. We've seen these things. The best hope you have is taking the settlement that they offered you. And I said, the settlement, I was all upset. The settlement, look, it's not even worth the paper it's written on. She has to give up all of her procedural protections, and if she does, even if a person comes to visit her that she doesn't know and they're caught with a dime bag full of marijuana, then she's evicted? I said, that's not justice. And she says, Cory, calm down. She said to me, look, if you choose to push her to fight this case, you're not doing your client justice. You don't represent your own cause of justice. You don't represent your own, you represent a client. You're a lawyer. And if you force her to fight this and she loses, you'll go home devastated. But she won't have a home to go to at all. I said, Cory, you can't take away this woman's right to make decisions for herself. She has to decide. Now, I remember going over to see her, to pick her up, to take her back to the legal center for what was probably the longest hour conference of my legal career. And I sat this woman down, this elderly, esteemed, reverential African-American woman that was worthy of all my respect, as my parents taught me. But the painful thing about this meeting was, here was this woman that all she could do, as I tried to explain to her legal concepts that I hadn't even mastered at that point, all she could do was cry and say over and over again, why are they doing this to me? I've done nothing wrong. Why are they doing this to me? And as I worked through that hour, I saw a miracle. Now again, if you haven't learned already, I'm a big believer in the miraculous. And the miraculous sometimes is so obvious or some small, the size of a flower, that most people just go along their way not noticing them. But this miracle came to me in the form of a question. And this woman who was crying there and trying to compose herself, finally she just puts her head down and tries to get me to stop speaking with her hand. And I stop, and she seems to gather herself to ask this question. And she goes to me, she goes, well, tell me this. If I fight this case, will it help other people? I started to look at her, and I can't believe she's even asking this question, given her circumstances. And I look at her and I said, ma'am, I said, if we fight this case and lose, we only have a 5 or 10% chance of winning. I said, but if we somehow win this case with only about a 5 or 10% chance of doing so, ma'am, I said, yeah, it would give me a precedent that I could use to help other people. And it almost seemed like all she heard was that 3-letter word yes, because her head goes down again and she puts up her hand for me to stop. And she seemed to just sit there a long period of time. And then suddenly these fragile old fingers curl up into a fist, and she slams it on the table. Her head jolts up, and she looks at me with these piercing eyes now. She pushes the chair back, and she stands up straighter than I had ever seen her stand. And she waves her finger at me, and she says, 5 or 10% is enough for me. We're going to fight. And then she strode out of that room with a dignity and a regality even that I had never seen amidst her spirit before. I sat there looking at my supervising attorney. My jaw was sort of dropped. She was looking at me, and we just stared at each other for a few moments. And then I remembered I had to give the woman a ride back to her house, so I chased after her and put her in the car. And I worked for 3 days and 3 nights on this case. Everything I could do. I was living in the law library on my phone. I even called Johnny Cochran, God rest his soul. Didn't return my calls. Everything I could think to do. And then on the 4th morning, I'm getting up and getting ready to go back to work. I get this call, and you know, this is your first case. I'm pouring everything into it. And I get this call from my supervising attorney and says to me, you know, Cory, I've got some bad news. And I'm like, okay, go ahead. What is it? And she goes, you don't understand. I've got some bad news. And I go, okay, what? And she goes, last night your client had a heart attack and died. And I remember just slamming down the phone, beginning to want to cuss like a sailor, throw things around. I was just so filled with rage about what I thought was a senseless injustice. And then suddenly I realized my arrogance. You see, here I thought that God had put the great Cory Booker there to help the poor client that I had. But in reality, I really believe that the universe put the great client there to help the poor Cory Booker. To me, the most powerful thing you can do, and it goes back to the point I made earlier about this idea of a balanced universe, that if you are seeking to have success in any endeavor, if you're seeking to invent something, if you're seeking to be in political office, if you're seeking to have a multi-million-dollar business, that one of the keys to being a success beyond your wildest dreams is always to find ways to live with a perfect resonance of your highest ideals. And the highest of highest ideals, I dare say, is this ideal of love. It's what the Hebrews call chesed. It's what the Greeks call agape. It's love that's not transactional. If you love me, I'll love you. It's understanding that we play a role in this world, that we are intricately combined. As Martin Luther King said so eloquently from letters from a Birmingham jail, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a common garment of destiny. That whatever we do resonates out beyond us in profound, elegant, and beautiful ways. And if we do those things with love and find ways to give back to other people, then we all rise up. I want to conclude with one last note. This woman, Miss Jones. I remember as we battled through in these projects. I lived there for 8 years in this high-rise complex. Fighting, we won the fight against a slumlord, but then the city came in and took over. And now the city was worse in many ways than the landlord we had. And we went through days without heat and hot water. My elevator, I lived on the 16th flight. I think back in those days I was a lot slimmer because I was walking 16 flights quite regularly. And just continue to be blown away by the profound beauty and love, unyielding, uncompromising love of this person in my life named Miss Virginia Jones. And I remember when something really bad happened to me, which I won't go into, but it was a day that my faith was shaken. My faith was shaken in myself, and I'll be frank with you, my faith was shaken even in the larger society in which we live. It was a time that I spent the whole night rolling around, frustrated and angry, feeling overwhelmed by the world around me, and what I thought was just this toxicity that exists in our culture that allows the most heinous acts to happen. And I remember getting up from an elevator and coming down in the morning, and there I see Miss Jones, this figure, And it only took me seeing the back of her, this powerful woman who embodies all the ideals I was talking about. It only took me seeing her from behind to suddenly shake myself loose of the negativity and the cynicism that was growing at my core. It was almost like her spirit reached back and smacked me upside my head. And I remembered seeing her, a story that she told me when I was interviewing her for Esquire magazine. And Esquire was writing this big article about the 40 best and brightest in America. And they called me and they said they wanted to write an article about me. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. I said, the reality is in my city, there are so many people that your magazines or newspapers or TV will never take notice of that are the greatest, most towering Americans I can ever imagine. And I said that this woman is, to me, one of the greatest Americans that's ever lived. And I said, let me write an article about her. So now I was doing more purposeful discussions with Miss Jones, and I was interviewing her about every aspect of her life. I had, maybe, I don't know how many column inches I had. It was really small, but I wanted to pack this article with just everything I could to show America that the greatest heroes from our country are not the people we read about in history books. It never was the case. You pick your chapter from America, whether it's the progressive movement, the civil rights movement, you name it. The heroes that we hail, that we name days after, are never the greatest ones. America is a wonderful story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, extraordinary examples of love on a daily basis that make transformation truly possible. So here I'm interviewing this woman, and Miss Jones, and she tells me the story that just I couldn't believe. And this was a story I remembered when I was coming out of my own bleakness. She told me a story about her son, who put on an American uniform. And I have such reverence for anybody that puts on, you may not agree with the military action that's going on, but if you put on an American uniform, to me it's a powerful thing. I just was in Fort Bliss seeing soldiers, visiting with them before they went overseas, and just was overwhelmed at these young men, 19, 20, 21 years old, young men and women. And so here her son put on an American uniform and went overseas, and then came back home. And this was in the 80s, and he had a mistaken identity. Long story short, Miss Jones told me that she was in her apartment on the 5th floor, where she lived for almost the exact amount of years that I've been alive. And she got a knock on the door. She opened the door. The person couldn't even speak. They were crying so much. Grabbed her by her arm, took her downstairs into the lobby of the building where I lived. And there on the floor was her son, who was home, with about 3 or 4 bullet holes in his chest, bleeding the lobby floor red, dead. So here this great woman who I revered, who I had known at that point for years, who had never told me the story before, and I can't even believe I didn't hear it. And I didn't know what to say to her. I sort of put my pen down and my pad where I'd been feverishly writing. And, I hate that you don't have the right words at the right time all the time. So all I could think to myself to say to her was, Miss Jones, I know where you live. I know the money you make. And Miss Jones and myself and a number of others in this building were paying market rent to live in the challenging conditions in which we were fighting. And I said, Miss Jones, I know the money you make. You could live anywhere. Why would you still live in this neighborhood? Why would you still live in this community or this building where your son was tragically murdered? And she looks at me and she says, why do I still live here? And I said, yeah. She goes, why am I still in Brick Towers? And I said, yeah. And I said, why do you live on the 5th floor live on the 5th floor in apartment 5A? And I said, yeah. And she crossed her arms and she said to me, she said, I live here because I'm in charge of Homeland Security. And I smiled. This, to me, is it. Is having a vision of yourself that's so large that you don't project the responsibilities onto other people. You take the responsibilities for yourself. That you have this unbelievable, some might call it arrogance, some might call it an astounding, miraculous view that you can transform the world. This view that that's not just a cognitive process, but you can turn that into a physical act. This understanding that you can do anything you want if it resonates with those higher values that you can make a transformation. My dad was an incredibly successful salesman. He became a marketing manager, won awards from IBM, and is now retired living in Atlanta. My mom and my dad still are living their lives. My mom ran a homeless shelter for a while in the city of Atlanta. They're still involved. My dad now is recovering from open heart surgery, fighting Parkinson's, but still lives with this abundant, effusive sense of humor, sense of love, sense of I may be in my elder years, but I'm still going to change this world. This conference, and I'm so grateful for being invited to share some of my spirit with you. This conference has a very purposeful view. You all are here to try to advance your businesses, to try to advance your families, and those are all good things. But don't lose the larger context in which we all operate. Don't shrink your vision of yourself. Understand that you are here for a purpose. There is no mistaking this moment. In this moment and the ones that will follow, you have the opportunity to unleash yourself unto the world. You have the possibility and the potential to be one of those Americans that truly creates a revolution in kindness, a revolution in love, a revolution in vision, and a revolution in imagination. This is the legacy that we as a people have inherited. We have a Statue of Liberty that sits with its back facing Newark. And I always say that we should have a Statue of Liberty, but we should also have statues of responsibility. We should have a Declaration of Independence, but we should also have a Declaration of Interdependence. We need each other so much. We are responsible for each other. This nation, as great as it is, does not reflect the profound dignity or potential of its people. We all are those people. Let us join together today, not only for individual success, but for the triumph of our ideals in a world that's so desperate for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mayor Booker. So we're wrapped up. The great job. Very motivational speech. Thank you very much for coming to the show. We're wrapped up, ready to go. The exhibit hall is open. The session starts soon. Real quick, are we doing the road rally tonight, Sean? 6 o'clock in this general vicinity will be the road rally. It'll be a fun event to come watch. And then tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., be back in this room for Ask the Experts, which is a great event. There's a lot of experts to ask. And again, tonight from 9 to 11 in the atrium area is the drinking area and the having fun area. So have a great day, everybody.